So, in this video, we will try to see one more reaction, one more response by the Indians. And this reaction, this response is called socio-religious reform movement, right. So, we are going to discuss socio-religious reform movement of 19th century, right. So, we are going to discuss socio-religious reform movement, socio-religious reform movement. Is it okay? Socio-religious reform movement of 19th century, right, 19th century, socio-religious reform movement of 19th century. Now, when we prepare this topic, socio-religious reform movement, there are many dimensions, like you will understand this reform movement of 19th century when you know some of the weaknesses of our society and religion in 19th century. So, first we can understand that what was the social religious conditions, right, in 19th century. Conditions in 19th century. There are many words that, right, we have to use to, right, write about the conditions, right, before this reform movement. So, what kind of conditions? We can mention that Indian society in the 19th century, Indian society in the 19th century was characterized by social obscurantism, and religious superstition, So, what was the condition of Indian society in the 19th century? Before the reform movement, Indian society was characterized by, right, social obscurantism and, right, religious superstitions, right. Then we can always quote Max Weber. Even Bipin Chandra quoted Max Weber. So, as Max Weber observed, right, as Max Weber observed, those who have sociology or public administration, they must be familiar with this Max Weber, a great thinker. So, as Max Weber observed that Hinduism had become a compound of magic, animism and superstition Who said it? Max Weber, right. So, this was the condition. Just to substantiate it, we mentioned Max Weber. So, what was the condition of society that time in 19th century, religion that time? Social obscurantism, religious superstition, right, and caste system was the steel frame that time of Hinduism, caste system, right. And because of this caste system, right, our society was divided into multiple, right, you can say sealed groups. So, therefore, caste system was also one of the important characteristics of 19th century society. And then the plight of women, was horrible, right? Parda system, sati system, right? So all kind of problem, right? Indian women, the status of women, Indian women was not good. So you will see that plight was not good, plight of women was horrible. Done. Then we can also mention that in Indian society in 19th century, the priest or intermediaries, exercised, they exercised an overwhelming, an overwhelming, exercised an overwhelming and unhealthy influence, and unhealthy influence on the minds of the people, on the minds of the people. Well, just I wanted to mention some point to suggest that what was the condition, right, of 19th century Indian society, and there was a need of reform, right? So why this reform? First thing that, right, you came to know that what was the condition. So why this reform? Why, you will see, why this reform movement? Why this reform movement? That we have to understand. Why this reform movement? Why? Or they can ask you the causes of this socio-cultural awakening. Why this cultural awakening? Right? So some point you can elaborate, like number one, why this awakening? Why this awakening? So we can elaborate because deterioration of religion and society, Why this awakening? Why this kind of proposal of reform? Because deterioration of the religion and society, right? So by the advent of the 19th century, you will see many evil practices, right, had crept in Indian society, Indian religion, and therefore there was a deterioration, and therefore this kind of awakening. Then the second cause, most of the historians they give, was threat of Christianity. Threat of Christianity. Threat of Christianity. So according to one view, threat of Christianity, Christian missionaries, right, they started propagating new religion with the help and support of the British officials. So that threat was also one of the important factor for this awakening, right? Threat of Christianity. Then why this kind of awakening? Number three, because of, you will see, the impact of British administration. Impact of British administration. Why this British administration play important role? Unity, because of it. Because of this unity. Unity as establishment, as the result of the establishment of the British rule, as the result of the establishment of the British rule, there was political unity, and Indians got an opportunity, to come into close contact, with one another, and they started realizing their weaknesses. They started realizing their socio-cultural weaknesses. Right? Then fourth point we can add, right, influence of Western education. Influence of Western education. Influence of Western education, literature, right? It played very important role, and it brought the Indian, right? into close contact with Western learning. It brought the Indians into close contact with Western learning and science, and this Western learning and science broadened and liberalized their outlook, right? They came into contact with many enlightened thinkers. They came into contact with many enlightened thinkers of 18th century. Right? In your world history, we have a topic called enlightenment of 18th century. Many enlightened thinkers, they started talking about equality, liberty, tolerance, right? So those thinkers also started influencing those people who were Western educated, right? So influence of Western education also played important role. So that this point you have to elaborate, you have to give example. So this also played important role in the rise of this socio-religious movement. Well, I hope you can elaborate. Then fifth point you can remember that there was inspiration from the glorious past also, right? So there was inspiration from the glorious past, right? Magnificent past, and right, those discoveries, right, made by European scholars like Sir William Jones and all those Indologists, right, they played important role, right? So in discovery of the India's past, and that also played important role in this socio-religious reform movement. And then we can also mention contribution of press. We also can add that the press made the exchange of thought easier and created favorable condition for a social cultural awakening. Press also played important role. And then seventh, and in the end you can mention contribution of great, right, reformers. Like Raja Ram Mohan Roy, Vivekananda, Dayanand Saraswati, Sir Syed Ahmad Khan, they also contributed in this kind of awakening. Fine. So I just try to arrange it. So in general studies they can ask you simple question, why this socio-religious reform movement? If you have 7-8 points, you can elaborate it. Is it fine? Now you have two dimension. One, what was the condition of 19th century? Social obscurantism, religious superstition, priestly dominance, caste rigidities, status of women horrible, this kind of condition. And why this socio-religious reform movement? So we can write down, we can elaborate these points. These 2 points are fine. Just I try to, you can say, tell you this idea through that format. The question they can ask and answer, it would be the format. Right. So these two area important. But there is one problem here. One problem is that there is a debate among historians. Debate is that whether this socio-religious movement was the result of Western impact. So what is the question? What is the debate? Debate is, so there is a debate, right, regarding this socio-religious reform movement, and debate is, was this a result of the impact of, was this a result of the impact of western colonial domination? Was this a result of the impact of western colonial domination? So it was because of this colonial rule. What you think? Why, right, this socio-religious reform movement, whether they were responsible for this kind of awakening? See, this kind of question is difficult to handle because you cannot ignore the role of West. Can you? I told you that their political impact, their Western education, Christianity, their science and technology, enlightened ideas, of course played important role. Can you ignore the impact of West in this awakening? So, West did play important role, no doubt about it, but what we have to add, that they actually challenged and we responded. So therefore, now all those modern historians, they consider that this socio-religious reform movement was an expression of social aspiration of newly emerging middle class. I hope you are getting it. What I said, this socio-religious reform movement was an expression of social aspiration of newly emerging middle class, and Western impact played instrumental role in developing a critical approach towards existing culture and institution, and because of that, introspection began about the strength and weaknesses of the present society and religion, and after this socio-cultural regeneration started. So, yes, it was a response to the challenges posed by the colonial rule. Fine, I hope you are getting it. So, you cannot ignore the impact of the West. You can appreciate the role of the West, but what was the role? They challenged, and we, Indian middle class, responded. How they responded? By looking back critically, and we responded by proposing a new reform which was based on East and West. Is this fine? So we can write down, we can mention that with the growth of colonial dominance, colonial rule, a new intelligentsia developed, and new middle class, of course we are calling them middle class, new intelligentsia developed, and Indian intellectuals or this intelligentsia closely scrutinized the country's past, they closely scrutinized the country's past and found that many beliefs and practices were no longer of any use, and needed to be discarded. And we can say that this new intelligentsia looked back critically because of this colonial challenge. They looked back critically there was a selective borrowing from the great outside world. There was a selective borrowing from the great outside world, and we recreated ourselves. We recreated ourselves. So we cannot ignore the role of West. Their presence played important role. Their challenge played important role. And therefore, right, if we can use the word of, you can say the language of Bipin Chandra, we can say that the socio-cultural regeneration of India, the socio-cultural regeneration of India in 19th century was occasioned by the colonial presence, but not created by it. Fine. This statement is enough to tell you the real position. So what Bipin Chandra also accepted, that the socio-cultural regeneration of India was occasioned by the colonial presence but not created by it. I hope you're getting it. Can you see? Occasioned by the colonial presence, but they did not create it, not created by it. Is this fine? You can handle this debate also. So in that debate, what we have to realize, that it was their, you can say, gift. No. They played important role, but their intention was not to make you aware. Their intention was not to give rise to this kind of socio-religious reform movement. But Indian middle class, right, realized the importance of this kind of awakening. And this awakening was just not, it was not based on only, right, their ideas. It was based on our critical approach. So this was the beginning of Renaissance. It is called Indian Renaissance. Indian Renaissance. We have historians who questioned this term, whether this kind of term can be used, because this kind of awakening, regeneration of India of 19th century was not based on some literally, you can say, or the sculpture, development of sculpture or the painting or science, but yes, it had some similarity with Renaissance, because this Renaissance, Indian Renaissance, was also based on some new ideas, some new themes, temperamental change, attitudinal change, and this was the beginning of modernization. Modernity began. We entered into modern phase. Fine. So when we talk about this socio-cultural you can say regeneration or awakening, of course the middle class was the social base. Middle class, it is very important to understand. Middle class, it was a middle class phenomena. Middle class was the social base. Social base. And what provided the ideological basis? Ideological basis of this socio-religious reform movement? All those enlightened ideas, right, like rationalism, like religious universalism, right, humanism. In world history you will see this kind of idea came out, right, after enlightenment, Renaissance, right. So this kind of idea, right, they provided the ideological basis for, right, for this socio-religious reform movement. So when you talk about socio-religious reform movement, rationalism, universalism, humanism, right, they provided the base. They provided the base. Fine, you are getting it. So what was the social basis of this reform movement? Middle class. What was ideological basis of this reform movement? These kind of ideas. So socio-religious reform movement of 19th century was based on rationalism, universalism, humanism, this kind of idea. They talked about rationalism. All those reformers talked about universalism. All those reformers talked about education, talked about glorification of man, humanism. Is it fine? Right? So, now you have idea about the ideological basis also. Now, what all are the general features of this reform movement? General features. General features of this reform movement. What all you can handle, what all you can write, that general features of this reform movement. What we have to understand, that the reformers of the 19th century did not stand opposed to the socio-religious system as a whole. They never said that changed everything. I hope you are getting it. They did not say that change the society, change the religion. What they did? They focused on the distortions and perversions. They never rejected the entire tradition. I hope you are getting my point. So this would be the feature. Then, as I mentioned, rationalism. So we can always write that all these reformers took a highly rational attitude towards any issues, social, religious, and there was no blind faith. Try to understand it. Now, there was no blind faith. Now, rationalism, rational behavior, questioning, no blind faith, and everything was judged by a rationalist critic. All practices, socio-religious, cultural, all practices were evaluated from the standpoint of social utility. You are getting it? Their perspective was universalistic. What they used to say? All the established religion of the world were true. Right? They conceived what? Universalistic church. Even Raja Ram Mohan Roy talked about universalistic church. Even Sir Syed Ahmad Khan also talked about this kind of universalism. They all were indifferent to the idea of extra worldliness. They were not ready. They were not ready to talk about God, moksha, soul, and they focused upon, their attention was human, this world. I hope you are getting it. They all exhibited democratic approach. They attacked inequality. They attacked caste system. They attacked priestly domination. They promoted education. They all talked about education, female education. They all talked about, advocated what? Liberation of women. So these are some important general features of this socio-religious reform movement. Is this fine? You are getting it? Now, with, right, you can say this kind of dimension, I just wanted to highlight this kind of dimension. Then in this topic, we have to remember some important reformer, like some important reformers and some institution who helped in this reform, some important reformer. some important reformer, right? So in different area, different reformer you have. Like suppose for your understanding, start with the East or the Bengal mainly. Of course, this Rinasa was Bengal based to begin with, Bengal Rinasa, right? So reformers, some reformers you have to prepare. First reformer and the first modern man, right, was Ram Mohan Roy, Raja Ram Mohan Roy, and his Brahma Samaj, Raja Ram Mohan Roy and his Brahma Samaj. Fine. So we will discuss Ram Mohan Roy in a separate video, separately, because they can ask you a separate question on Ram Mohan Roy. So Ram Mohan Roy is the best representative, first modern man, right? Then second, in East you can talk about Henry Vivian Desrosiers. Henry Vivian Desrosiers. Henry Vivian Desrosiers, Anglo-Indian teacher of Hindu college. Henry Vivian Desrosiers, right? Henry Vivian Desrosiers, right? And Henry Vivian Desrosiers, a young man, teacher, Hindu college, influenced by French Revolution, right? He was a founder of Academic Association, Society for General Knowledge, right? This kind of association associated with Henry Vivian Desrosiers. His followers were called Desrosians. And he was so popular that he gave rise to what we call Young Bengal movement. Remember this, Bengal movement associated with Ram Mohan Roy. But Young Bengal movement associated with Henry Vivian Desrosiers. And he was so popular, as I said, that S.N. Banerjee, right, called him what? Pioneers of modern civilization of Bengal. Pioneers of modern civilization of Bengal. So Henry Vivian Desrosiers played very important role. But all you can say, only problem Henry Vivian Desrosiers had was, right, he was radical. He, right, could not understand the ground realities of India, right? And therefore some historian, Sumit Sarkar, right, said that this Young Bengal movement left little or no distinctive or permanent impression, right? So he could not understand the right mentality or the ground realities, and his radical approach led to some criticism. Okay, well, so when you talk about this reform movement, you must concentrate on this man, very popular man. I said Henry Vivian Desrosiers, very popular man. Fine. Okay. Then in East, in Bengal, the third important name you should remember, Ishwar Chand Vidyasagar. Ishwar Chand Vidyasagar. Ishwar Chand Vidyasagar. Right? He was a great scholar, Sanskrit scholar. He developed new methodology of teaching Sanskrit. He was known for, you can say what? Widow Remarriage Act 1856, establishing girls' school, right? So Ishwar Chand Vidyasagar, you have to remember. And then in Bengal, you have to remember Swami Vivekananda. Swami Vivekananda. Swami Vivekananda. Right, Swami Vivekananda, you all know how he aroused consciousness, right, among youth, right? How he said service of Jiva is service of Shiva. How he participated in that great conference, and his lecture motivated us, and he was called what? spiritual father of Indian nationalism, spiritual father. He talked about Vedant, right? Then when you can say discuss Bengal, we must discuss one man called Kesav Chandra Sen, Kesav Chandra Sen, right, who published Indian Mirror, Kesav Chandra Sen. He played important role in Brahma Samaj also, right? So these names you should remember in East, in Bengal. Then after that, and with Swami Vivekananda, I hope you all know his Guru Ramkrishna Paramhans. So these 4 or 5 names you have to remember, you have to prepare, right? These 4 or 5 names. Then in the West also you will see some reformer, right? Some reformer, like in the West you can remember Bal Sastri Jambhekar, Bal Sastri, right? Jambhekar, who was associated with a weekly Darpan. So he is called pioneer of the intellectual movement in Maharashtra, Bal Sastri Jambhekar. Then in Western India, you should remember a very popular name, Gopal Hari Deshmukh, Gopal Hari Deshmukh. Gopal Hari Deshmukh, he is popularly called Lokhitvadi, Lokhitvadi, right? Then you can remember Mahadev Govind Ranade, Ranade in the Western India. M.G. Ranade was also one of the important name, Prathna Samaj, Mahadev Govind Ranade. Then in the Western India, you can remember Vishnu Sastri Chiplunkar, Vishnu Sastri Chiplunkar, Vishnu Sastri Chiplunkar, Marathi writer. Nibandh Mala, very popular contribution, Nibandh Mala, Vishnu Sastri Chiplunkar. Then in Western India, right, Maharashtra, right, there was a very important reformer, G.G. Agarkar, G.G. Agarkar. So these names you should remember, and sometime when some of the reformer, because of some reason they are in news, they ask detailed question about them. Sometime very tough question they ask, but if they are in news, Gopal Ganesh Agarkar, these names. Then if you can remember some name in North India, North Indian reformer, you can remember a very popular name, Swami Dayanand Saraswati, Swami Dayanand, right, Saraswati, Swami Dayanand Saraswati, who was known for, Swami Dayanand Saraswati was known for Arya Samaj, very popular, Arya Samaj. Very popular Arya Samaj, established in 1875, Arya Samaj. Swami Dayanand Saraswati, and he was originally called Mool Sankar, Mool Sankar. He wrote Satyarth Prakash Ved Bhasya Bhumika, Satyarth Prakash Ved Bhasya Bhumika, and he considered Vedas as infallible, infallible. No one can question Vedas, and he gave the slogan, back to the Vedas, back to the Vedas, back to the Vedas. And his Arya Samaj movement was based on 10 principles. So 10 principles of Arya Samaj movement, 10 principles. Fine. So Arya Samaj also played important role in, you will see, in North. Then you can remember Theosophical Society, theosophical, very important reform movement, theosophical society, very important. Theosophical society was formed right in 1875 only, 1875 in South, right, you can say, in 1875, not in South, sorry, right, it was found in US, America, right, New York, by Blavatsky, Madam Blavatsky and Olcott, Blavatsky and Olcott, Theosophical Society. So in 1875, not in South India, right, you can say, it was in America, 1875. They came to India in 1880s and they made their headquarter what? What was their headquarter? Their headquarter in near Chennai, Adyar. And in 1890s, Annie Besant took over the leadership. 1893, Annie Besant took over the leadership of Theosophical Society. Annie Besant took over the leadership of this society, and it became very popular. Right, Theosophist, right? They talked about our ancient Indian religion, philosophy, science, ancient wisdom is necessary to find the ultimate truth, they used to say it. So they played very important role. Why? Because they advocated the revival and strengthening of ancient religion like Hinduism, Zoroastrianism, Buddhism. They talked about our Indian philosophy of the, you can say, Upanishads. They wanted to develop divine power in man. I hope you are getting it. They are giving you some statement regarding Theosophist. So yes, they were in one sense mystic also, because they wanted to develop divine power in man. Is it okay? And they wanted to develop a special relationship between man and God. How? By contemplation, by prayer, by revelation. Fine. So Theosophist also played important role. Is it fine? And then you have many, right, you can say the smaller organization, many smaller organization, right. For example, you will see that you have, right, like Tattva Bodhini Sabha, related to this socio-religious reform movement, Tattva Bodhini Sabha, they are asking this kind of also, Tattva Bodhini Sabha, right, 1839, and this was, right, founded by Debendranath Tagore, Tattva Bodhini Sabha. Then you have Manav Dharma Sabha. There are many organizations. Manav Dharma Sabha, established in 1844 in Surat by Durgaram Mancharam. Then you have a, you can say, organization related to this awakening called Radha Swami Satsang. Radha Swami Satsang, right, in 1861, established in Agra. Radha Swami Satsang. Then you should not forget, right, you can say, an organization, very popular organization called Prathna Samaj, right. Atmaram Pandurang was associated with it. Atmaram Pandurang, right. Then Deccan Educational Society of Agarkar, Pune, Deccan Educational Society of Agarkar, right. Then Dev Samaj of Lahore, then Social Service League of N.M. Joshi. Social Service League of N.M. Joshi. Right. And Seva Samiti by H.N. Kunjuru in Allahabad. Seva Samiti by H.N. Kunjuru in Allahabad. Fine. So, these are some important reformers, examples you have to remember, and there is no end, right? There is no end. There was reform movement not only in Hinduism, in Islam, in Parsi, and in the, you can say, the Sikh reform movement also, but we will take up, right, those topics separately, right, for better understanding. So we will take up those reform movements separately. So you will see that in 19th century there were reform movement, and what was the impact? Then they can also ask you, what was the impact of this reform movement? Impact of this reform movement. What was the impact? They provided unity. Unity. They popularized education, particularly female education. They popularized female education. They tried to democratize Indian society. They tried. We cannot say that society was democratized, but they tried to democratize Indian society. Then they provided a new consciousness about our rights, right? Then they provided a secular outlook. Now, secular outlook, right? They protected our culture from those assault of colonial culture. Then impact, they contributed in phenomenal growth in our literature, journals, press, right? So all these reformers, they were associated with many activities, right? They were associated with many literature, many journals. So it was a great age for Indian journalism, right? So you should remember what was the impact of this socio-religious reform movement, and they provided the base for our nationalism. But they had some limitations also, you know this. They had some limitations also. What all limitations? I told you it was a middle class phenomena, not mass phenomena, middle class, only middle class phenomena. Then they were confined to only urban areas, so it was an urban phenomena. Then Raja Ram Mohan Roy talked about universalism, reformism, but there are reformer like Dayanand Saraswati, he talked about religious revivalism. And religious revivalism, like this word revivalism, religious revivalism gave rise to what? Right, negative tendencies, unhealthy tendencies, which of course gave rise to communalism, right? So some religious tendencies, some you can say the revivalist tendencies also you can see. And this reform movement never talked about artistic or scientific aspect of our heritage, right? So that also considered as one limitation. They were confined to, limited to social and religious reform only. So these are some of the important limitations.